In today's tutorial, I'm going to show you how to make continuous bias binding. This is bias tape that's in one long piece rather than several small cuts. While they sell prepackaged binding in the stores, it's often hard to find just the right color to coordinate with your project. And perfectly matching binding is a great finish to any project. One thing to consider when making your bias binding out of scrap fabric is the size of the square or rectangle that you're using. This piece of binding was made using a 10 by 14 inch rectangle, and you can see that it does have a good amount of seams. However, the smaller square or rectangle that you use, the more frequent the seams will occur. Even using just a slightly smaller piece of fabric, for example a 10 by 10 inch square, results in significantly closer seams. This rectangle here, my 10 by 14 inch rectangle, created about 3 yards of bias strips that were 1 inch wide. A 10 by 10 inch square usually creates about 2 yards but has much more frequent seams. So when you create your bias binding, you want to determine what is most important to you. If your goal is to save fabric, use a small piece of scrap that's the exact color, and you don't care about the frequency of the seams, then a small 10 by 10 square is probably fine. However, if you don't want a lot of seams in your binding, you may want to consider using a larger piece of fabric. A fat quarter is usually a pretty good size, and a half a yard makes even more. Personally, I wouldn't go much smaller than a 10 by 10 square. If you do, you'll have seams just everywhere. When you make bias binding, rather than just making straight strips of fabric, you cut the fabric on a diagonal, which is called the bias. And the reason we do this is because the bias of a woven fabric stretches. And when you need a binding to go around the edge of a curve, such as on a hot pad or something like that, you really need that binding to stretch around the curved edges. So when you begin the process of making your bias binding, what you really want to do first is identify the grain line. Because if your fabric is not oriented correctly, you won't actually end up with bias binding. When you're making your bias binding, if your fabric still contains the selvage edge, that's the factory finish, that helps a lot. Because that factory finish, the selvage edge, is your grain line. It shows you the direction that the fabric was woven. But if you're using scrap fabric and the selvage isn't there, it can be difficult to figure that out. And you have to know the direction it's going if you actually want to end up with bias binding. The first thing I usually like to do is clip an edge. So on woven fabrics, and this works great on cottons. If you clip an edge and pull, the fabric will tear along the line of the thread. And that gives you a nice straight edge to work from. So I'm going to go ahead and press that so it's flat. And to determine which edge this is, I'm going to gently tug my fabric both parallel and perpendicular to this line. So my straight edge that I just tore, I'm going to grasp the fabric and I'm going to pull the same direction as that edge. And then I'm going to turn my fabric and I'm going to pull perpendicular to that edge. When I tug it this way, the fabric stretches just a little. When I tug it this way, it doesn't move at all. The not stretchy edge is my grain line, so I'm going to go ahead and mark that. I'm going to use a Sharpie so you can see it, but on my fabric I usually use a pencil. So this is my grain line, which means the direction that is perpendicular to that my edge that only had a tiny bit of stretch, that was my cross grain. To identify the bias, what you really need is a triangle with two edges that are the same. So for example, if I measure 6 inches from my corner, and then 6 inches perpendicular to that, it creates a nice isosceles triangle, which gives me 45-degree angles. And so this is my bias. So if I was going to use this piece of scrap fabric to make my bias binding, I would want to make sure that my strips are cut in this direction because it will give me the greatest amount of stretch. You can see how much that stretch is in comparison to this edge. So when you begin making your bias binding, make sure you know where the bias is on your fabric. Now that we know how to identify the different edges in our fabric, let's start making our binding. Here's the fabric that I'm going to be using to make my bias binding. I have already identified the grain line and cross grain on my fabric. You may want to mark this on your fabric just so you don't forget which is which. Since I'm going to be making my bias binding in just one sitting, I'm going to be using an air erase marker for this because it shows up a little better on camera, but I often simply use a pencil. I'm going to put one dash on the edge of my grain line, and I'm going to put 2 dashes on the edges that are following the cross grain. And now I'm going to find the bias. My fabric is 10 inches tall. So from this corner, I'm going to mark 10 inches away. And then I'm going to connect the corner to my dot. This creates an isosceles triangle, which gives us angles of 45 degrees. So that will be spot on the bias. So this edge right here is going to be my bias line, and so I'm going to want to cut all of my strips of fabric going the same direction as that. So I don't forget where my bias is. I'm going to mark this with 3 dashes. Now I'm going to use my scissors and cut across the line. I've now created a bias edge on my fabric. Now I'm going to put the two together. It's a little easier to do this one when my fabric is facing right side up, so I'm going to flip it real quick. Now I'm going to align the 2 grain line edges. So I'm going to grab this little triangle here and flip it over so this edge matches this one. And now I'm going to sew the two together using a 1/4 inch seam allowance. You may want to pin this in place to help it stay secure. When I sew binding, I like to use a stitch length of 2.0. This makes the seams just a little stronger. Now I'm going to press the seam flat and then press the seam open. The shapes have been sewn together and the seam is going the direction of the grain line. You can see based on my marks, this edge right here is my cross grain and here is my bias. So when I make my binding strips, I want them to be going the same direction as the bias. So I'm going to take my parallelogram here and I'm going to turn it so that the bottom edge is my bias line. So your seam should now be at a diagonal. And now you can mark your strips. You can make these however wide you need to. I commonly use 1-inch bias strips, so that's what I'm going to be doing today, but you can make them smaller or larger depending on whatever you need for your project. The narrower you make these strips, the more yardage you'll get from your bias binding. So I'm going to line the 1-inch mark of my ruler with the edge of my fabric, and I'm going to draw a line across from edge to edge. You do want to make sure you go all the way across because these markings will be essential. Now I'm going to do the same thing again, 2 inches from the bottom edge. If your ruler is not as wide as mine, you can use the previous line as a guide. Just make sure you're pretty exact. If one of your line gets off and you use that for a reference, it will skew all the other lines, so just make sure to be pretty careful. You'll notice when I get to the top edge here, I have a little section that's too narrow. This is not wide enough to make another strip of binding, so I'm going to go ahead and trim that section off. My binding lines have been drawn and I'm ready to sew the edges together. The first thing I want to do is mark my seam allowance. I'm going to be sewing the 2 sides together with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So along each side edge, this is the crosswise grain. This is the one that has 2 dash marks. I'm going to go ahead and draw my 1/4 inch seam allowance. Again, you do want to be pretty precise with this and go all the way from edge to edge. Do the same on both sides. When we sew a seam, we sew with our fabric right sides together. So normally what I do is simply fold this in half and stitch. However, since I'm making continuous binding, I want the binding strip to be in one long loop all together. Because of that, when this edge ends, it needs to attach to the next section down here. So when I line the edges, it's going to be a little offset. One of the reasons we drew our seam allowance line down here is to show us where our edges need to match up. Where our binding line crosses our seam allowance line is our intersection point. So I'm going to keep an eye on these points on both sides of my fabric to make sure they're aligning. So the top edge of this binding strip is going to align with the top edge of this binding strip right at that intersection. And then this intersection point at the bottom of the same strip will align with the top of the next one, and so on. It is a little tricky at first, but once you get used to it, it makes sense. So I'm going to go ahead and fold this right sides together. And you'll notice it doesn't want to go the direction that you want it to. So you're going to have to slide it over, and you're going to end up with a tube of fabric that's just a little bit awkward, and that is normal. So you can see that I've let the edge extend a little bit here. The top of this line is going to align with the intersection of the one on the back. I'm going to match up the raw edges and pin. This one is usually the hardest because there's not much fabric here to work with, but it gets easier as you move along. So now I'm going to go to the next intersection point on the front here, and I'm going to poke my pin right through that intersection, and I'm going to match it up exactly with the next intersection on the back. I'm going to align my raw edges and pin. And I'm going to continue that process down the entire length. When you get to the end, you'll notice that it hangs off just like it did at the beginning. You just want the edge of the fabric at that seam line to line up with your intersection. So you now have a curved tube of fabric, and you should have a little edge extending on each side. Now I'm going to go to the sewing machine and sew along my line, and I'm going to use a stitch length of 2.0. And you'll notice that my fabric doesn't really want to lie flat, so I'm going to have to stop and adjust quite a bit as I sew. Now I'm going to press the seam open, and I'm going to do this in small sections. And then I'll turn my fabric and continue. Now it's time to cut the binding into strips. You do want to take care when you do this, be precise as you can, because if you're a little off, you'll make one side too small and the other too large. As I trim this, I'm only cutting through one layer. You can see here I accidentally trimmed the back side, and you don't want that to happen. So just lift the top layer up a smidge as you cut, and that will help. At this point, depending on your project, you may be finished. However, if you'd like to, you can go ahead and pre-fold your binding. To do this, I like to cut an angle at the end and make sure that there aren't any seam allowances in that section. A bias tape maker works great for this process, but if you don't have one, you can simply fold the two edges of the bias strip towards the center and press. Just make sure they don't overlap. I've got a 12mm bias tape maker here, and these are pretty nice to use. Just slide the end of the strip inside. Grab your iron and follow it along. I do often like to use a silicone spatula to protect my fingers from the steam, as it can get quite hot. You do want to be careful of how the bias tape maker is working for you. I find sometimes it folds the two edges of the fabric together just great, and sometimes there's a large gap in between. So just make sure you're checking. You don't want a big space in between the two edges. You also do need to take care because it can get a little hot sometimes, so make sure you pull by the handle or have something to protect your fingers. When you get to the seam, make sure it's laying flat. And after you pull through, make sure it's stayed flat. And continue pressing. And our binding is finished. If I have a lot of extra binding that I need to store, I often like to wrap it around an index card or a small piece of cardboard to keep it nice and folded for future use. I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. Until next time, happy sewing!